Hi everybody, I'm Laura Eastlake and welcome to the latest EHUNineteen virtual speaker series event from Edge Hill University. Stick around after today's talk to hear a bit more about some of our upcoming events and our new MA programme that we're launching in 19th Century Studies too. But for now, I am delighted to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Will Tattersdill is Senior Lecturer in Popular Literature, Liberal Arts and Natural Sciences at the University of Birmingham. He writes and teaches about the relationship between literature and science, especially in genre fiction, and he has published in particular on science and fiction in the periodical press of the 1890s. He's currently writing a monograph about the social history of dinosaurs from 1850 to the present, which sounds amazing, and is beginning work on a new edition of H.G. Wells' short stories. So don't forget you can join us for a Q&A with Will at 6 p.m. on Wednesday the 10th of February, but for now he's going to talk to us about Mars in the magazines.
Hello everybody, and thanks for having me. My name's Will. You're looking at a Google Ngrams graph, which, for those of you who don't know, it tracks the usage of certain words in a corpus of this one's British English print publication over time. So between 1870 and 1900, you're looking at a graph of how often the word Mars is used in a certain range of publications. Now, there's all sorts of problems with this kind of data and trying to use it to understand anything meaningfully about the way print culture works. But if you look at this graph, you'll notice there's a particular peak just after 1877 that is followed by a slightly lower peak in the early 1890s, starting in 1892 and running on for a couple of years. And those spikes correspond almost perfectly with the periods in the late 19th century when the planet Mars was in what we call favourable opposition with the Earth and Sun. So Mars at opposition means that the Sun and Mars are exactly in a line on either side of the Earth. In other words, that the planet Mars is the closest it ever comes in the course of its orbit to the Earth when they line up. And that means that Mars is brighter in the night sky, that it's easier to see even these days if you're an amateur and you head out in the garden with your telescope. And what we can see in 1877 is a response to the very close observations of Mars at opposition, where the moons Phobos and Deimos were discovered, Mars's two moons, and also where Schiaparelli observed on the surface what he called canali in Italian, which means channels, but which was mistranslated to canals in English and set off a whole chain of explosive and very science fictional ideas about who might be up there. So that is Schiaparelli's drawing, or a drawing after him, of his canali, of what Mars looks like. And then in 1892, so a bit more than a decade later, there's another favourable opposition. And in the intervening period, that kind of a lull, telescope technology has improved significantly, and people start to get excited again. I like this because this Ngrams thing, because it kind of shows you how word usage can track the movement of the planets. I suppose it's the closest I'll ever get to believing in astrology. And I like this idea that Mars as an idea waxes and wanes in print culture, just as the planet spirals around above us. But it's not just me kind of kookily staring at an engram that gets given me this idea. They noticed it at the time. So here's P.L. Addison in Pall Mall magazine in 1895. There's a considerable amount of discussion as to the probability of Mars being inhabited. He's talking about the Mars craze and the favourable opposition a few years earlier in 1892. Letters appeared in the daily papers, and nearly everyone had something to say on the subject, and there was even some talk of trying to attract the attention of our Martian neighbours by heliographic signals. What language was to be used, and whether the signals were to be according to the Morse or some other code was apparently left for astronomers to decide, but scientists declined to undertake this interesting work. And in the meantime, Mars drifted away from us on his circumscribed journey through space. I really like this passage for all sorts of reasons, I think, because it's very aware of one of the main things I want to talk to you about today, which is the connection between science and scientific interest and the periodical press. So something that I like to think about an enormous amount is kind of that relationship in the periodical press between kind of science and technology and the quote-unquote normal reader, and what they get to see, how they get to imagine the world in consequence of this. Addison is actually making a reference here, although he may not know it himself, with the heliographic signals thing to a very particular conversation that took place in the pages of the Times, and that was led by this figure, Francis Galton. And this is the one respect in which Addison is wrong when he says scientists decline to undertake this interesting work, because it's definitely still on Galton's mind in 1895, when that Addison piece was published, and he will go on to publish a much more detailed version of this heliographic signalling plan in November 1896, and that's what I'm going to be talking about for most of today. Galton, for those of you who don't know him, is most famous as the father of eugenics. He, at the time, was in his seniority and was very much respected for the work that he'd done on anthropometrics and eugenics, of course, but also on other kind of mathematical domains. For example, he was responsible for the first weather map that was printed in a newspaper. What I'm going to be talking about with him today is largely accepted from a book that I published on the subject a few years ago called Science Fiction and the Fin de Siècle Periodical Press. There's a comma between science and fiction, which is something I'm going to be implicitly talking about a lot today, I suppose. And in kind of going back to the material on Mars, which forms the basis of my first chapter in that book, which I hadn't thought about for a little while, it was nice to have the opportunity to think about how I would have done things differently. I think one of the things that I regret about this part of the book is not doing enough explicitly with the eugenic legacy of this idea, and with Galton as a eugenicist. I think at the time I took the view that I was writing about something that was a little bit different, and that was happening at a different kind of moment in Galton's career. But I now recognise that that's a little bit lazy, and that eugenics is something that needs to be confronted whenever we find it. So I'm glad to have the opportunity in this paper to do that, and I will come back to the subject kind of right at the end. But the other thing that I want to do that's not so much in the book is interface this with some new work that I'm doing on the short stories of H.G. Wells. So in this book, H.G. Wells is kind of a theme. I'm never directly kind of talking about him, but he comes up in all of the chapters pretty reliably. But what I wanted to do in this book is tie each of the chapters to one of his big, famous scientific romances, War of the Worlds, First Men on the Moon, and so on. So I kind of left his short fiction alone. And in this paper, what I'm going to do is put some of that material together with one of his short stories and kind of think about the Galton-Wells relationship in the press. My aim, I suppose, is, apart from giving you a reason to read the book if you want to learn more about this stuff, is to give you a sort of indirect sense of how Mars looks in the 1890s, of what that idea of the planet Mars feels like. It's very different from today, I think. So just to give you a sort of illustration of that, this is a reasonable picture of Mars from the 1892 opposition. We can't photograph down telescopes yet. That's a very early 20th century innovation. So we're still astronomer eye to the telescope, sketching with their other hand. That's how we're doing this. But if you compare that image of Mars with a recent one from the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, and indeed there is Google Mars now if you want to go and look around this globe in detail, you can see how Mars is a kind of blank canvas upon which lots of ideas, plausible and implausible, can reasonably be inserted. I'm not just thinking of Edgar Rice Burroughs's. But when scientists have serious conversations in the 1890s about what Martian civilization might be like, they're not being completely frivolous or ridiculous, although that may come into it. It is a blank, and for them there could be anything up there. It's not disproved yet to everybody's satisfaction. And indeed, there had been, since the 1877 opposition, a reasonable consensus of there being an atmosphere on Mars. That was kind of visible to the telescopes of that time. But this paper is not just about Mars, it's about signalling Mars. That idea Addison mentioned of using heliographic signals to actually communicate with the Martians. So this is that conversation that Addison was referring to. This is Francis Galton in the Times during the favourable opposition of 1892. With funds and goodwill, there seems no insuperable difficulty in sending signals that the inhabitants of Mars, if they have eyes, wits, and fairly good telescopes, would speculate on and wish to answer. And there's an assumption built into Martian thinking here, of course, which is something that I'm going to come back to in the closing moments of this talk. For now, I want you to focus on this idea of how Martian communication could happen in principle. When we're talking about heliographic signals, we're talking about gadgets that look something like this. This is a heliostat, actually very slightly different. The reason I've given to you is because Galton invented it. He was always inventing things. So, and earlier, much earlier in his life, in the 1850s, whilst he was travelling in Africa. So this is a very nice example of Galton's kind of perennially wide-ranging interest coming into things. Invented this little version of the heliostat. What it's for is redirecting the sun to signal across the landscapes. If you want to send a signal a few miles, perhaps, without, of course, radio or anything like that, without an infrastructure, and without sending someone on a horse, this is how you do it. Now, could that work between Earth and Mars? When I was doing this research for the first time, I spoke to a laser physicist at the Rutherford Appleton who told me, actually, it would kind of be possible with a big enough laser. Wouldn't use reflected sunlight, which is how the heliostat works. It's not completely impossible, but it's kind of on the lunatic fringe, especially because, as we now know, there is no civilization up there to talk to. It's not completely impossible. Galton himself understood this. So he wrote that his own method was not practicable, at least not without considerable addition and modification, as it requires the object to be visible towards which the flash is directed, but Mars is not visible to the naked eye at day. So he's already spotting problems with the heliostat plan. And as Mars recedes in the sky and in the public imagination across the 1890s, this idea never quite leaves Galton's mind, but it does become for him more about what you'd send than how you'd send it. It becomes a question of how you'd send a meaningful message to a civilization where you had no other form of contact, no way of establishing a common language. And it's this that is the focus of this article that I'm going to be talking about today, called Intelligible Signals Between Neighbouring Stars. Stars here meaning stars in the night sky, so planets, for our purposes. And this is published in a journal called the Fortnightly Review in November of 1896. Central to the success of the article is this idea of what Galton calls intrinsic intelligibility. That is the idea that messages have to be able to be deciphered by any intelligent man or other creature who has made nearly as much advance in pure and applied science as ourselves. So this is the problem that Galton sets himself to solve, right? You've got the ability to flash on and off, dot, short dash, long dash. That's what he gives himself. Can you construct a language using just those signals which anybody, given time, could understand? So we're not thinking about Morse code here, because Morse code doesn't work unless you have the key, unless you know what dot dash dash means. There's no way to tell intrinsically. Can you make a code that decodes itself? Well, Galton says, yes, you do it with maths. this is a way of thinking about Mars, I think. But it's also a way of thinking about the fin de siècle and about periodical culture. Intrinsic intelligibility. And beyond that, it's a way, as I will come back to at the end, of thinking about imperial arrogance. But I think intrinsic intelligibility is a really useful idea to have in your pocket when you're looking at the periodical press and thinking about how it might be situating itself to be able to be used. So when Galton characterizes this as a pure maths problem and says, well, it doesn't matter what the external circumstances are, because certain flashes and certain orders are going to obviously suggest certain things. I'll say a little bit more about how that idea works. I'll pick a couple of holes in it, and then we'll talk about how that kind of collapses under the weight of simply being in the periodical press. So firstly, just to give you a little more idea how Galton's scheme works. And by the way, in this talk, I'm proceeding on the assumption that you don't know this article, because I think I'm almost nearly the only person in the world who cares about it. If you have read it, you might want to skip ahead or be patient with me for a couple of minutes. But here's Galton's plan. Every line begins with a dot or more dots, then follows a dash, then a word of 2 letters. There is 1 dot at the beginning of the first line, 2 at that of the next, and so on regularly up to the 7th. The symbols at the end of successive lines are those of the successive combinations of dot dash line taken in order up to the 7th, the 8th of which is long dash short dash, and the 9th of which is long dash are not used. The arrangement suggests that the dash means is equal to, and that the symbols are those of numerals. So this is how you start, according to Galton. You create a numeral system and an equal sign, and then you can get a greater than and a less than sign, and you can go up from there until you've got pictures. So by the advanced stages of the article, we've got this bit which I won't read out, but you can kind of see, again, he's in very mathematical, technical language here. And he's essentially using the communication system to plot out coordinates so that we can send images around the place. He proposed a similar idea for the telegraph, by the way, to send pictures around the Earth. So this is his idea, and maybe you're already spotting a couple of the problems in it. For example, the line break. How's he doing the line break? That's difficult. Picking apart the maths in this is not really my agenda here, partly because I'm not qualified, partly because the fact that he thinks it's viable is much more interesting to me than whether it's viable or not. And there are clearly all sorts of ways in which it doesn't quite work. But he's serious about it. And I think that's really important. You know, he characterizes it as a caprice, but he works on this for years. And he uses, if you look at the language in this passage I have up on the screen, this is not frivolous, right? This is somebody who has a serious idea, not necessarily about communicating with Mars, but about this mathematical language at the very least. And it's in maths and it's in statistics. He's on home ground here. But here's where he's not on home ground. After kind of outlining the first kind of details of the scheme in a little preface, Galton says, the simplest way of explaining my method is to suppose that Mars began to signal to the wonderment of our astronomers, who sent descriptive letters to the newspapers from day to day, out of which the following imaginary extracts are taken. And kind of here are the newspaper extracts. So if you look at this image again, this is a few pages into the article, and you can see that they're numbered. That type is smaller than the type of the introduction and conclusion of the article, and indeed the rest of that issue of the Fortnightly Review. So they are being presented as quotations, of course, from non-existent newspapers. And those newspaper extracts are kind of decoding the thing piecemeal so that we can follow the process. It's a reasonably good SciComm strategy in certain ways. It's not unique to Galton at all, but it does mean putting an imaginative framework on the thing. And it does mean you end up with stuff that from a purely scientific standpoint is completely useless, like newspaper entry 6, which is this is the whole thing. A large type telegraphic dispatch appeared in all the evening newspapers. Complete decipherment of the first part of the message from Mars. Full particulars tomorrow. Signed Director of the X Observatory. Now, it's almost nothing really. But what I think Galton does here is he activates an entire fantasy universe, because as the reader of this article, all you have to do is kind of move your eyes to the next line. But I think he has you in empathic contact here with somebody who has to wait a day for it. So there's a gesture here towards suspense, but there is also a gesture here towards the world in which the suspense is much bigger, is in fact regulated by the periodical cycle, the daily press in this case. So immediately we start to see these imaginative techniques of newspaper quotation, which Matthew Rubery and others have argued is essential to the suspense techniques of the novel in this period and just before it. When I read things like this, especially with the X Observatory in there, I think always of Edgar Allan Poe and the Murders in the Rue Morgue half a century earlier, which of course also presents the facts of the case as newspaper articles for the purposes of exposition, but also because, and this is Rubery's argument again, there's something simultaneously sensationalizing and cold and distant and objective about the newspaper that's very useful for the passage of fiction. So Galton finds it here, right? So there are these serious elements to the idea, but as soon as he tries to present them in the periodical press, by giving them the apparatus of periodicity, of the newspaper, right? This fantasy universe starts to intrude on it. I won't go into the details, but there's a lot of the origins of this idea survive in Galton's archive at UCL, and none of them have any of this newspapery apparatus or any of the other kind of fantastic elements until he starts writing it for print, for the Fortnightly Review. And then it gets even more carried away with itself. So here's a little bit from slightly later. At this point, Galton is thinking about why everything seems to be in base 8 in the Martian communication system, and he's saying, well, maybe because that's the most useful number we can get with just a dot, a dash, and a line of short signals. Maybe 8 is a good system. But then he says, a clever little girl who has helped us much by her quick guesses entreats me to add her own peculiar view, which is that the Mars folk are nothing more than highly developed ants, who count up to 8 by their 6 limbs and 2 antennae, as our forefathers counted up to 10 on their fingers. But enough of this. I love this passage. Why do I love it? I think, so the me here is not Galton, right? So this is one of the moments, and there's not many, where we realise that he's really got into the character of this astronomer, the director of the X Observatory, who's making these reports. I love it for the clever little girl, that it's not his idea about the ants. Her whole backstory, she's barely in the article, but you can see it all. And of course, we're in the decades after Alice in Wonderland here, this precocious girl child who's telling the scientists how to do their job, sitting in the corner of the observatory, overhearing them making suggestions. There's a whole amazing little sci-fi story in there, isn't there? He can't help himself. And he knows that he can't help himself. That's the other thing that's really important about this passage here, is the ending. But enough of this, he says. And is that his astronomer character talking to himself, or is it Galton talking to himself? Get back to the maths, Francis. I think it's that. I think it's both. What all of this sets up, or what I want to try and use it to set up, is this idea of intelligible signals, this article of Galton's, as being in some ways a genre collision, right? Is that it's popular science, but it's not just popular science, because it kind of becomes fantastical or science fictional, however you want to conceive of it to yourself. And that it does so in spite of itself in some ways. Because once you're in the periodical press, it kind of has to. And this is the wider argument of that book I wrote that I mentioned at the start, is that in the body of the general magazine, this particular kind of periodical that would have printed popular science alongside kind of political essays, but also alongside fiction. And these things bleed together, and that's how you get genres like science fiction and the new romance kind of boiling out of that that admixture. So my wider thing about periodicals is that they create new ground for generic combination, recombination. And I think we see that here. If we think about the particular periodical that Galton chooses, the Fortnightly Review, we can see that, scholarship around this periodical, and this is by my old supervisor, Mark Turner, has focused on this point as well. The Fortnightly, by blending the discourses of high and low culture, by placing a philosophical review article alongside an instalment of a serial novel, would have sent conflicting signals to the periodical reading public. 2 shillings fortnightly instead of 1 shilling monthly. Fiction alongside serious review-like articles. Where was Fortnightly to be read? In the club, the drawing room, or the study? And perhaps if you're not a Victorianist, the second half of that quotation doesn't really resonate with you. But this is a time when periodicals and the Fortnightly was one of the more staid ones that I know about, especially by the 1890s. For example, it's not illustrated. It's not aimed at a mass market in the same way that the New Journalist stuff of the late 80s onwards was. But nevertheless, we're seeing this sea change, partly as a result of the development of the half-tone process, which makes illustration easier, new printing technology, which makes it easier to create these things at volume and to sell them cheaply, and of course, a generation of newly educated readers coming off the Education Act who are able to consume them in their new suburban commuter lifestyles. So that's the kind of the Victorian press kind of context here. How I found Intelligible Signals, that article, is not, as I found most of the other stuff I write about, just by sitting down and reading loads of periodicals, though. I found this because the curator at the Galton Archive at the time, Natasha McEnroe, said to me when I told her what I was writing my PhD about, Galton wrote science fiction. And this is what she pointed me to. This is absolutely fascinating because when you read it, it's not science fiction, but it's also not science fiction. And that's what everything in this period is, right? It's not science fiction and not science fiction. Science fiction as a term doesn't come along until the very early 1930s. So we're at exactly that moment of emergence, if you like, where things are new. And I think that emergence is something that is documented and also caused by the periodical press. To me, all of this stuff, I appreciate that I've been speaking a little bit abstractly for the last 5 minutes or so, gets more persuasive when we look at how Galton's idea bounces around in the wider periodical context. And so I'll do this a little bit with the figure of H.G. Wells. I'm going to start by talking about a story of Wells's called The Crystal Eggs, one of his better known stories, I suppose. And it was published in May 1897. This is the cover of the August 1926 Amazing Stories, which I've used here because when it first appears, it's in the New Review, which also doesn't carry illustration. So here is a picture for us to look at least, while we're thinking about it. But of course, Amazing Stories is a pulp, and the context here is extremely different, and Wells, I suspect, would not have liked it very much. The reason that I'm doing that, I suppose, is that ProQuest, which has the British Periodicals database with all of these periodicals scanned into it, is still redacting all of Wells's stories for copyright reasons, even though the copyright on them has now expired. So if you happen to work at ProQuest and you're watching this, that's something you need to address, because when there is, for example, a global pandemic, some of us who think it's important to look at these things in their original periodical publications can't get the page numbers and have to cite their slides by referring to John Hammond's excellent complete Wells short stories instead of to the original publication, which hurts me probably more than it does you. Anyway, The Crystal Egg. May 1897 New Review. We are 6 months out from the publication of Galton's article here. There isn't necessarily direct correspondence between the two, but I think it's kind of interesting. What happens in The Crystal Egg is that it's a pawnbroker's shop, and there's this crystal egg that the owner of the shop doesn't want to sell, and it turns out, to cut a short story short, that the owner has become obsessed with staring into the egg, because in it he sees a curious landscape, only fleetingly, kind of out of the corner of his eye as he looks in. And it turns out, they discover, after doing some tests, to be live footage of the surface of Mars. So what they learn is that there's another crystal hanging in a tower on Mars. You can see that in the Amazing Stories picture, which is why I've given it to you. And that crystal is, Wells says it's en rapport with the crystal back on Earth. So if you gaze into one, you can see at the other under certain conditions. For Ursula Le Guin, this is the origin of the Palantir, the crystal balls that Sauron and Saruman are using to communicate in The Lord of the Rings. And not just as a communications technology, although of course it is a communications technology between Mars and Earth, hence its appearance in this paper, but also because, like the Palantir, the crystal egg has a vaguely kind of corrupting influence over anybody who glances into it, which is interesting. And there's still a sense of decoding, the sense of decoding that Galton gives us in this, because the guy who can look into this crystal can't really understand what he sees until he relays it to a scientific interpreter. So there's still this idea of decipherment going on. That's another similarity between the two pieces. Also, Galton, like Wells, doesn't explain the how. So this goes back to what I was saying of he becomes more interested in the message than the medium, I suppose. That the how the crystal works is not something Wells talks about. As Jules Verne fans everywhere will tell you, Wells is never interested in how it works. He's interested that it works. How it got in the shop. Did the Martians put it there? Have they got the planet under observation? That's kind of implied, but we never find out the answer. So both Galton and Wells's pieces are about what is communicated and the means that communication takes, rather than the technology, rather than the how of it. And what Wells shows us, as you will have got a sense from that cover on the previous slide, is just as weird as ants, giant ants. There are some other kind of moments of contact between the two pieces, I think. For example, there's this moment where they realise that there are lots of these crystals on towers that they can see when they gaze at Mars, and that they reflect the setting sun. They're kind of flashing in the setting sun. And that is what a heliograph signal looks like if you're on Earth receiving a signal from elsewhere on Earth. So that seems to me to be interesting. There's a kind of echo of his language. Remember that bit I quoted before, the simplest way is to suppose? There's a kind of echo of that in this bit towards the end of the story. Imagine the impression of humanity a Martian observer would get who, after a difficult process of preparation and with considerable fatigue to the eyes, was able to peer at London from the steeple of St. Martin's Church for stretches at longest of 4 minutes at a time, identifying some of the same problems of incompleteness and the failure of things, visual signals this time, to be intrinsically intelligible. And I think doing so in quite a similar register, actually. And speaking of register, there is this interesting line in Wells's story as well. Nothing indeed could be less visionary or more matter of fact. This idea that the weirdest things about the story make complete, rational, scientific sense. When the crystal faded, it was put into its box in the proper position, the electric light turned on. Mr. Wace asked questions, he's the scientist, and suggested observations to clear up difficult points. Nothing, indeed, could be less visionary, right? And this is always Wells, right? Always the quotidian and the weird are hand in hand rather than opposites, especially in his short fiction. Always, it's somewhere in the home counties that something incredibly bizarre is taking place, and these things are being forced to meet each other. And this, I think, is part of Wells's pedigree as a writer of non-fiction, as well as fiction. And he of course has a prodigious output writing popular scientific articles as well as the fiction for which he's known today. Now, none of this is to argue that the crystal egg constitutes a direct response to Galton's article, or that Wells necessarily read it. We know he'd read it by 1900 because in The First Men on the Moon there is a direct reference to it. This bit of it was published in, I think, February 1901, maybe March. So we know he'd read it by then, and if you ask me personally, I think it's extremely likely that he read it when it came out. I can't prove that, but I don't need to prove that because I'm not really talking about direct influence here so much as resonance, so much as things being en rapport with each other, right? What's the mood of Mars in the periodical press more generally? We can see this again if we look at the much more famous H.G. Wells work from the year 1897, one I'm going to assume you're a bit more familiar with and say less about in terms of plot summary. So this comes out in April to December 1897. In other words, the Crystal Egg comes out in May whilst this is being serialised in Pearson's magazine. It's a very different kind of publication, very much associated with the new journalism. Pearson also founded the Daily Express. In America, War of the Worlds is serialised in Cosmopolitan magazine. The New Review, which had serialised The Time Machine, Wells's first kind of breakthrough novel in 1895, is again stayed and unillustrated. But we have, in War of the Worlds, we have Warwick Goble's lovely illustrations, one of which I've given you here. The usual periodical context for War of the Worlds, the one you're probably familiar with if you know the novel, is Nature, the scientific periodical. It definitely doesn't print fiction. In the opening pages of War of the Worlds, Wells, who had of course written for Nature himself on numerous occasions, quotes an article reporting some strange lights during an unfavourable Martian opposition in 1894. Strange lights which Wells says are the casting of the cannon that's going to fire the Martian space capsules towards the Earth. Now that article in Nature is real. It doesn't, of course, make any guesses about Martian life or anything like that. It's just describing an atmospheric phenomenon or something like that. But Wells takes as his jumping off point for the War of the Worlds this real article published in a real journal to which he had himself contributed many times. So again, as always with Wells, we find this admixture of reality and fantasy and of the bizarre with the quotidian, the surface of Mars, with the pawnbroker's shop, or with the house by Horsell Common where the capsule lands. And I just want you to notice that Galton is doing this exact same thing, right? That although you've got Galton is non-fiction and Wells is fiction, it doesn't really make sense to think of them as separated along those lines because Wells is using all this non-fictional stuff so much and writing his own non-fictional stuff so much, and because Galton is using his imagination so much and kind of creating this imaginative world as a way of conveyancing his idea, that at some point it's more useful to think about these things together than to think about them separately. So, War of the Worlds starts being serialized about 5 months after Intelligible Signals is published. This, in my opinion, is a little bit of a tight timeline to argue that there's direct influence between the two. We know that Wells wrote the whole of the War of the Worlds before sending it off to be printed. But again, I'm thinking about resonances. So what resonates between these two works published periodically in reaction, if you like, to the Martian oppositions of the early 1890s? Okay, well, here's one. So this is when the first cylinder Martian space capsule lands on Horsell Common. And there's this delegation organised of humans who go up to greet the Martians. There have been hasty consultations since the Martians were evidently, in spite of their repulsive forms, intelligent creatures. It had been resolved to show them by approaching them with signals that we too were intelligent. Flutter, flutter went the flag. It's a white flag, by the way. First to the right, then to the left. It was too far for me to recognise anyone there, but afterwards I learned that Ogilvy, Stent and Henderson were with others in this attempt at communication. It doesn't end well, by the way. Spoiler alert. But of course, what is in that, right? Hidden deep is that idea of intrinsic intelligibility, is that idea that if the Martians are sufficiently civilized, and of course they're too civilized, I'll say more about that later, then they will recognize what the humans are trying to do as an attempt to communicate. There's an idea of a mathematical code, the waving of a flag, even implicitly the universality of a white flag for surrender, which of course is a misconception, as this delegation will learn to its cost. So there's a resonance between the two texts that might be interesting to us. Here's another one. I already gave you the bottom thing on this slide. I already gave you. It's that complete decipherment thing from Galton's thing. I think this pairs remarkably well, like cheese with wine. In the afternoon, the appearance of the Common had altered very much. The early editions of the evening papers had startled London with enormous headlines, a message received from Mars. Again, Wells chooses newspapers as a way of getting things across, chooses to sensationalize and realize this vision of the Martian landing through a newspaper. And it's always struck me, since long before I was interested in periodicals, if you can imagine such a time, it's always struck me as interesting that Wells says a message received from Mars here, when what's happened is a space capsule has landed. That always struck me as an odd way to phrase it. But of course it is a message, even if the message includes a messenger, even if the message is non-verbal, as it will turn out to be. And this is the point where it might also behoove us to remember that the whole of War of the Worlds is war reporting, is periodical war reporting, as we would have found it in dispatches from the Boer War, for example, at almost exactly the same time. Big part of the periodical press at this time. So that newspaper framing is common to Galton and to Wells, and this is only the most kind of obvious moment where that's the case. And thirdly and finally, I want you to think about how the Martians respond to that delegation with the white flag. It's with heat rays, right? They vaporize them. Again, sorry, spoilers. It's only a few chapters in. They vaporize them with heat rays. And Aaron Worth has pointed out that there is a real similarity between the Martian heat rays and the heliographs that the British were using at the time. Here's a passage from Wells which kind of makes this point. It's from a little bit later in the book. Through the charred and desolated area, perhaps 20 square miles altogether, that encircled the Martian encampment on Horsell Common, through charred and ruined villages among the green trees, through the blackened and smoking arcades that had been but a day ago pine spinneys, crawled the devoted scouts with the heliographs that were presently to warn the gunners of the Martian approach. So apart from noticing that we're again in the register of the war correspondent here, the thing I want you to notice is that the scouts, this is the British Army of course, they're using heliographs to communicate with each other. It's a military thing, and Aaron Worth looks at this and says, of course it's a military thing, but the military aren't using these in England, are they? There's always a colonial overtone to them. And that is, of course, the case for Galton's own one, which is invented, like I said, during his travels in Africa and relayed in his Art of Travel of 1854. He's very much the colonial gentleman abroad when he writes that text. And so this, and I'm working towards a conclusion now, is to bring back the thing that, like I say in the book, I left a little too much in the subtext for my liking now, which is Galton's founding interest in eugenics. We can say that he's on holiday when he writes Intelligible Signals, and he is. And we can say that he did other things in his life, which he did. And we can say that eugenics isn't in Intelligible Signals, but I think it is. I think this is where that maths leads, that interest in being able to boil things down, boil language down to mathematical propositions, is directly coming from the same logic that we can understand people by their measurements, that we can perfect the race by acting upon those measurements if we take them carefully enough. So I think if it's not eugenic itself, it comes from the same set of assumptions. And the other assumptions that it makes, of course, are to do with the character of what a civilization is. This is from very near the end of Galton's piece. So to place, he says, the idea, the principle of the whole system, what we want, is to place the inhabitants of neighbouring stars, planets, in intelligible communication if they were both as far advanced in science and art as the civilized nations of the Earth at the present time. In other words, we can talk to the Martians, but only if there is someone as brilliant as Francis Galton among the Martians. And I think this is where, the modern reader of science fiction is perhaps a little more equipped to pick holes in Galton's plan and to talk about how anthropocentric it is in terms of its supposition, for example, that a Martian looking at the night sky and seeing that the Earth star is brighter today would care. Even if it has eyes and can see those stars or understand them in the same way, even if they have telescopes, even if they have that kind of curiosity, in assuming those things, those curiosities, those desires to reach out, which are still today framed as virtues, I think, to see what's out there, to boldly go where no one has gone before. But that is the colonial impulse as well, isn't it? To see what's over the horizon and to make it known to ourselves, to place it into the structure of our system of knowledge. So if we can say that intelligible signals has an anthropocentric bias, I think we also have to say that it has a colonial bias and that it expresses that bias with the heliograph, with a piece of colonial machinery. And, this is something that Wells highlights as well. Because why are the Martians using the heat rays, the bigger versions of the heliostats, right? They're not for communicating. They kind of are elided together. They are used to destroy. The Martian conquest works for the Martians, Wells says, because they don't consider humans to be people. They're so much further evolved. They're kind of just brains, right? That's the kind of Darwinian bit of the novel that I haven't really talked about today. But the end point of that is, it's like stepping on bugs. We the Martians, don't have to think about that as a moral act because we're talking about a different order of civilization. They don't recognize us as civilized. And that, I think, is a caricature of the implicit attitude that underpins Galton's writing. And, of course, that Wells makes more explicit in his comparison in those opening pages of the novel to the invasion of Tasmania, for example. So it's kind of the basis of his critique of empire in this novel, Wells's critique of empire, that it's bad when we think ourselves above people, and that the Martian failure is a failure of empathy. And I think if we look at this article of Galton's, we can see that failure of empathy playing out, and we can see it much more starkly and much more horribly, as Angelique Richardson and others have written in the rest of Galton's corpus. How do we end? I've been throwing out a lot of suggestions about the ways that periodicals mix things up. And they do so, I think, often in spite of themselves. And sometimes really in spite of themselves. And it, of course, varies from publication to publication. But I think in the 1890s in London, you have this really fertile moment where things are really talking to each other. And I mean structurally talking to each other. I mean forms are talking to each other. I don't just mean people are in conversation. And that's what I mean by kind of trying to hijack Wells's metaphor of the crystals being en rapport with each other. To think about the periodicals as generative. And I think when we think about them with empire, all of these publications are obviously very much pro-empire. They're coming out of London at the height of the empire in terms of geographical span, pretty much. And they are in loads and loads of ways really imperialist. And one of those ways is that formal desire to encompass everything, to publish all the genres. But by that very act, they kind of bring things into fertile and rebellious new conversation, and they result in the creation of new things. And so there's always that push in the other direction that's coming out of them as well. And I think that's one of the reasons that they're exciting to read. And that's something I write much more about in this book of mine, if you'd like to hear me talk more about it, as if this wasn't enough. The last thing I want to draw your attention to is, rather than that bit, if they were both as far advanced, I want you to think about that bit, science and arts. I think it's very striking in this moment that Galton admits that the arts are important. I think that's one of hopefully many things that a scientist writing this article today would behave a little differently. And I think one of the things that periodicals do is bring science and arts together, and I think that's why they're politically useful for us now. But I also think they make another even more powerful political point about empathy, both in their successes and their failures. If we really want to talk to the aliens, we first need to figure out how to talk to each other.
Thank you so much for that paper, Will. And don't forget, you can join Will for a live Q&A on Wednesday, the 10th of February at 6 p.m. If you have questions, you can ask them in the live chat. On the Q&A, you can ask them using your camera and microphone. Or if a question occurs to you and you want to send it over ahead of time, you're welcome to email it to me as well. And just before you leave, I thought I would tell you a little bit about some events we've got coming up from EHUNineteen. The next event in our speaker series will be on Wednesday, the 10th of March, and Dr. Eleanor Dobson from the University of Birmingham is going to talk to us about performing Egyptian magic in the 19th century, which sounds amazing. And a couple of days after that, on March the 12th, we have an event organised by our own Dr. Emma Butcher and Melissa Gustin called Breaking Barriers, 19th Century Visual Culture in the Woke Age, which thinks about Victorian art history and the way it looks to certain pasts and how it might speak to certain presents of our own. And just finally then, I am delighted to announce that EHUNineteen in September 2021 will be launching an MA in 19th century studies. So if you are an undergraduate thinking about master's study, if you are a staff member with staff who might be in a similar position, then we would love to talk to you about our new MA in 19th century studies. It's designed not only to give you a fantastic grounding in the 19th century as a period, from the Romantic period through those Victorian decades, and also Victorian popular culture as well, and digital humanities. But we're also really keen to make it an MA that speaks different careers that you might want to follow. So we think a lot on this degree about how you might use your research knowledge, not only in academic careers, but in education, in heritage, in publishing and beyond. So many of our students get involved in things like designing fantastic exhibitions, and of course the degree is based out of our absolutely beautiful campus in the northwest of England. So get in touch with us if you have questions or if you want to hear more about that. We'll be running an information event online in the future, and I've listed here the links if you are interested in any of those events. So for now, let me say a final thank you very much to Dr. Will Tattersdill, and we will see you at the live Q&A Wednesday, the 10th of February at 6 p.m. Thank you so much for joining us.